Hi, everyone. Welcome. My name is David Chavern. I'm the president and CEO of the News Media Alliance, and this is episode 2 of News Take. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, News Take conversations are supposed to be somewhat wonky chats designed to offer unique perspectives and insights around all of the innovation taking place in the news industry and how different organizations are applying it or facing similar challenges. We will get somewhat in the weeds with people who are changing the news industry, particularly those helping us make new, better news products and whose perspectives aren't always heard otherwise. Today, we're talking to someone who's absolutely at the forefront of evolving newsroom and publisher technology aimed at improving the reader experience. We'll talk about everything from core web vitals to privacy first products for newsrooms. But all in all, in the bigger context of why it matters for news and news publishing industry. Hopefully you'll walk away from today's conversation having learned something new that you can impress your friends with. I'm not sure that's, or at least impress your coworkers with. I think I know I will, but most of all, we hope that's something you can take back and think about and ponder how you might use things you might hear here in your own businesses and publishing enterprises, and how you can continue to evolve your news business. So with that, I'm super excited to welcome Aram Zucker-Scharff to the show. Aram is the engineering lead for privacy security compliance at the Washington Post, where he works with publishers to maximize site performance and revenue. He has also worked on the Post's ad tech R&D and big data teams. Aram has developed open source tools for publishers and consulted on content strategy for digital newsroom workflows. He's also one of Folio's magazine's 15 under 30 in the magazine industry. That's awesome. And he's also got a killer Twitter game. So that's why I'm super excited to have Aram here today. Welcome to the show, Aram. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me. It's great to digitally speak with you, David.
Excellent. Well, super excited both because you're certainly well known as a big brain in the business, but also, frankly, are working with one of the most digitally innovative and forward news publishers out there. So let's start there. Talk a little bit about what you do at the Post. What your role is there, and then maybe segue a little bit into how do you see news publishers broadly as being different or maybe similar to other folks in the digital content business or digital ad tech business? What do you do at the Post, and then for news, how is news different than other kinds of pieces of this industry?
Sure. Well, right now I have two hats that I'm wearing at the Post. I'm transitioning out as the senior solutions engineer for Zeus customers, which means I'm still currently, and I have just previously been working a lot with small to medium and some large publishers on getting them figuring out how to use Zeus technology, how to integrate our ad technology, and how to implement it to improve revenue and performance. And as you said, my current sort of top of mind piece is the lead engineer covering privacy within the part of our organization that covers subscriptions, user data, and identity. And so that means I am building out tools and support for privacy first designs, prototyping next generation privacy respecting methods that allow us to accomplish the goals we've previously sort of set, and really trying to figure out how to take on some of these big challenges that are rising in the privacy space, communicating with our users but in effective and clear ways about what we're doing and how it can affect them. And that sort of brings us into the big changes for publishers in the digital space that are coming out of this shift towards privacy. I think that for the last 5 to 10 years, publishers have spent a lot of time trying to unwind the mistake of basically allowing third-party ad tech to take over their business agendas without necessarily sharing their values. When we come from a publisher perspective, obviously we are businesses and we have to work and make profit and all of the stuff that has to happen there. But I think that especially as we get towards the more local end of this side, there is a need to rebuild user trust outside of the third-party environment, and really sort of think about how to transition towards a more privacy forward way of thinking, while still relying on sort of this bank of user trust and revenue that is native to publishers in a way that it really isn't across the rest of the digital space.
Yeah, it's interesting. I have to be honest, as somebody in the public policy front of these things, you know, news publishers, not the Post specifically, but the industry broadly, has sometimes been caught kind of meandering in the middle on privacy and ad tech, to be honest. The industry didn't create these systems, didn't create cookies, didn't create all the ad tech applianceware to which we're subject. We kind of get pulled into them, but then there's income attached to it, right? I mean, there's a lot of income from, or at least some income coming up from the digital ad sector, a section of the business that you don't want to lose, particularly when you're financially constrained otherwise. So, frankly, news publishers have often been mad at the system, but also depend on it to some degree, and have been sort of stuck in this, again, for want of a better term, meandering middle on privacy too often. As we're moving into the sort of post-cookie world, let's talk about, how should what should first principles be for news publishers? First of all, we're kind of interesting business because, as you said, we're a trust-based business where our value is almost entirely that we have trusted relationships with readers who are willing to come to our properties and pay us for it. But, in terms of moving to new products, in terms of thinking about privacy from the world of somebody in the news business, what do you think the core kind of first principles should be? What are kind of our guide stars as we move through the changes in this ad tech space?
Yeah, I think the first thing is to really sort of identify exactly what you're talking about in that meandering middle piece of it, right? A lot of the technologies that publishers have sort of become addicted to on the business side are these invasive, invisible user tracking systems, poorly performing ad scripts, and endless cascade of like third-party network requests. And these are all threatened by this big shift. And I think that it is reasonable to look at that and say, kicking these things that we have perceived as dependencies for our business is going to be rough. But the flip side is it's very much worthwhile. These aren't actually the dependencies. This is the situation that emerged because publishers were not as involved. And when we get out the other side, it's going to be a little bit more healthy because we've become so hamstringed by this established ecosystem. The post-cookie and privacy regulated world is sort of an important opportunity to clip our strings and figure out how to walk on our own. There's going to be a hard push identifying users through logins, various types of signups and registration walls. I think this is an important intermediary step as the digital ecosystem shifts. But also I think that this is something that publishers should approach not necessarily as a new thing. Understand your audience isn't a new suggestion to any publisher. And so it's important now. It was important before. It will continue to be important, even as the regulatory environment. And we can see, for example, the language in the recent House bill that came out, which, while it may not pass or it may be vastly changed, it sort of shows that we're in the midst of this long-term shift away from individualized user targeting one way or another. So I think, when we think about first principles, a good thing is to understand any technology in terms of the impact on user experience. And that impact is sort of broad reaching. We have to understand that that any technology exists sort of within the context of overall site performance. And that's really important for us because that is an aspect of user experience. And user experience really needs to be sort of the guiding light in how we handle these things. And when we sort of look at that as a filter for how we adapt new technologies, that's the process, or decide to build technologies if we are capable of doing so, as different publishers are. That's sort of the approach that got us, for example, to the Zeus performance product that the Washington Post now sells. We originally started it as a look at the existing ad tech landscape and saying this doesn't perform. And this was before Core Web Vitals even. We were just looking at pre-bid JS at the time. And we said there are performance metrics that we think we're capable of hitting as a publisher, and we want to hit those metrics. And so we built something different. And there's a lot of opportunity for an approach there. And I think the other thing to keep in mind, though, is that it's bigger than just one script or one ad tech company or anything like that. It really is sort of a rebuild in how we maintain our websites and how we build new websites, or rebuild our existing websites. It becomes this sort of filter on our decision-making process, that we need to be clear and transparent with our users, and we need to be performant as well, because that's what users are going to be looking for more than anything else. I think publishers are going to also have to take as one of their first principles a shift towards contextual as part of an overall strategy away from third parties. This is important to us. We've put a lot of time and investment into this, and I think it's a wide variety of ways to approach this. Right, we can develop software because we're the Washington Post, but obviously not every publisher has that capability. But every publisher does have tagging and categories and verticals and that type of stuff. And taking a look at that and being more organized and clearer and more specific is going to be an important way to sort of make your content more clear and available. We also look at like ways to partner with technology or to build technology that focuses in on those principles around contextual. This is another example of how we ended up building a product for this. The Zeus Prime product became one of our big priorities to build out because it is a contextual targeting product and because we believe that's the absolute bedrock of the future of publisher revenue. And because it's the most important way that publishers can clearly distinguish themselves in the larger digital landscape. Good, high quality, well-edited content, writing, journalism, right? The creation of that is a value that publishers have that not everyone in the digital landscape does. And so emphasizing building out things that support contextual is a way to emphasize a new ecosystem of digital monetization that is aligned with publisher priorities. And I think the last really sort of guiding principle is that we always have to approach things privacy first. There's obviously this change in third-party cookies and regulations, but even beyond that, we have a relationship with readers, and that relationship is fundamentally built on trust. And when that trust starts to fail, that's going to cause problems all across our organization and every possible piece of it. And so being privacy first allows us to maintain that trust in that space, that first sort of contact between the user, the browser, and the website they're looking at. And that's really important to hold as well.
Yeah, wow, there's so much in there. Let's take pieces of it at a time. First of all, I tell you what I'm hopeful about is, again, we have been on the sort of receiving end, for want of a better term, of the ad tech ecosystem, right? And we haven't, as an industry, we haven't really been able to drive many of the technical or other outcomes. If we have a regulator, it's Google, as we saw today. By the way, they're just coming out with a new regulatory answer on the topic product. But also, it is this mass system, as you know much better than I, in which there's a whole then host of middlemen who are just have drains to value all through. I've often said we end up a situation where you have advertisers both overpaying and publishers under receiving, right? And then there's a huge mass in the middle, kind of exploiting both ends. So it's a long way of saying I'm hoping this may be one of those turns of the wheel where news publishers can start to assert their own ideas and values about their ecosystem. And I'm going to get back to that in terms of the processes out there in the world, sort of deciding these things and our influence. But let's pick out two particular things you talked about, because they do strike me as places where news publishers can make their own sets of decisions. One is performance, and also developing contextual products that really work. Now, let's talk about core web vitals in particular in this moment. Interesting because again, it comes from Google, right? Is they essentially the regulator talking about performance, but it's also not all wrong. And we've done some studies through American Press Institute in the past that actually showed one of the things that impacts readers' trust in a news site is performance. Weirdly, if the pages load slow or you're getting hammered by ads, people trust the content less. And that is a connected thing. So, in terms of, let's take those two things, performance, core web vitals, how do you look at that as yet another sort of Google, regulation in the space, or as a valued set of targets to design around and meet, and there are ways for publishers to take advantage of that. And then after that, I want to talk about the context, sort of the incipient building of new contextual products in the digital ad space. But let's start with core web vitals. I mean, how do you look at that? I have to tell you, I'm always reminded that when Google rolled out AMP, it was all about how this was for readers, right? It was all about performance. And isn't AMP great? Because it turned out to be AMP was mostly great for Google. But, how do you think about core web vitals and how publishers should be reacting to that?
Yeah. I actually really like core web vitals. I think it's a mistake that a lot of people make to look at them as like abstract numbers or arbitrary requirements. I think you hit sort of the nail on the head that performance is a sign of trustworthiness for our readers. And so making the site performance better is about making it easier for readers of all types to engage and trust with the site. I actually really like talking also about the posts experience with Core Web Vitals specifically, because we looked at that as an opportunity to extend and grow an overall focus on page performance that had started significantly earlier, actually back in the day of AMP, when we looked at how AMP was performing and looked at how our pages were performing and said, hey, these things, some of these pieces are underperforming in ways we can definitely improve. And like that's actually, we don't talk about it a lot, but this is actually one of the reasons why we initially started development on Zeus, because we looked at how ads performed on AMP and said, why can't they perform that way outside of AMP? Yeah. And so as soon as Core Web Vitals started being discussed, we were a very early adopter. We built a cross-team collaboration to cover our entire organization and really sort of thought holistically about how to improve this process and what's going on there, because we saw this as an opportunity to win, both in terms of like, sure, the requirements are coming from Google and this can mean an improvement in our SERP placement and that type of stuff, but also just generally the ability to have a better website and to have a better reading experience and to have a better relationship with our readers through performance. And so to be really effective, we really approached it holistically. The ad tech scripts have always been one of the biggest blockers of page performance. And like I said, Zeus was one of the things we built out in order to be really effective at getting the Washington Post to the highest levels of Core Web Vitals scores. And as much as I'd like to pitch all of your listeners on buying Zeus, it is happy to go ahead. Yeah. It's a great tool for that, and it's been super helpful.
I should ask for a sponsorship money. Damn, I missed something there. Okay, no, feel free. It's a great product, so feel free to talk about it.
So I think like Zeus has been a huge help. Those ad tech scripts and performances and how they load on the page and are handled on the page, those are big blockers. But they're not the only factor. Our director of product in Red, Amanda Hicks, wrote a great article about examining page layouts and page designs, along with the creative formats that exist inside ads that a lot of publishers direct sell, and looking at those as part of the process of handling usability processes and usability problems, especially because layouts and some of these creatives are big causes of layout shift. And the work she's been doing, combined with the way Zeus optimizes towards viewability, means that we've seen our ad metrics, our ad performance metrics like click-through rate and ITR, and even viewability really sort of tick up because people are seeing the ads load instead of seeing these pages jump around.
Yeah.
So not only has this move towards Core Web Vitals level performance helped the page performance, but it's helped our revenue performance as well. And then the excellent folks working with our engineering manager, Julie Bacon, worked on our site engineering team and built an entire release pipeline that leverages the Google Search Console, our analytics tools, and a continuous deployment process that allows us to move towards an active feedback loop, pushing every release towards greater performance. And then part of that process as well was rethinking about how we sort of build our website from the ground up. We chose to emphasize server-side rendering as much as possible and looked at the best design solutions for client-side features like placeholders and overlays, with the goals to really improve FID and CLS, the Core Web Vitals main metrics, right? And then on top of that, we even incorporate this process into understanding how we handled paywalls and reg walls. There is, these things can pop up, and often the processes that people use for rendering paywalls and reg walls can be very ill performant.
Yeah.
We originally handled these with iframes, and now we've switched to using site components instead. So that way they're built into the page instead of having to load yet another network request. And even those components get themselves performance testing and tracking using Core Web Vitals as sort of our guiding post.
Wait,
And
can
then,
I interrupt you
yeah.
1 second? What do you think is, let's say, the most common, we'll call them mistakes, the most common incorrect approaches that news publishers in particular, just because that's what we're talking about. If you were to walk into XYZ news publisher, what would you likely see that they're doing off on the performance side almost immediately? What are the most common things that sort of drive you crazy when you see it that people should be thinking about off the top of their heads?
Yeah, I think the first one actually goes back to what I was talking about earlier, which is the layout shift problem. Too many publishers don't really think about how their components load on page, how things like ads load on page, but also non-ad components, and can cause stuff to move around. And I think, the easiest way to really push your development and production process towards paying more attention to that I do personally, and that I encourage other folks within our organization to do, is, the browsers have the ability to set your rendering process based off of a 2G connection instead of your hyper fast home connection or whatever it might be, right? I think a big mistake a lot of developers make is they think that everybody who connects to the website has the same connection speed that they do. And so a lot of these shifts that happen, they don't even notice it because everything loads so quickly. But a lot of people, obviously less under COVID, but even under COVID, are using phones and slower devices and slower internet connections to parse the site, and getting a much worse experience because things load in slow and then they change position on the page, they grow, they shrink, whatever it might be. And I think the other big thing is, there has been a really big trend among web developers to move towards, I won't get too technical into it, but basically React or React inspired technologies for building web pages. And I don't think there's anything that is fundamentally wrong with those technologies, but how you choose to render them onto the page can have a huge impact. The sort of default approach for someone who's picking up React is you have a big package of JavaScript that loads onto the site and then sort of builds your site really quickly. And thankfully, I think a lot of people are moving away from that and moving towards server-side rendering of the site. And that's a huge win that a lot of publishers can make. But it is a long process if you're not already doing it, especially for those with less engineering resources, because it's an infrastructure change. But I think it's worth it. It's worth it for the reasons you said, right? It's about establishing trust with the users. It's worth it for Core Web Vitals. One of the things that really helped with us is that I think as people look at should we improve our performance and how should we prioritize this, is that our Core Web Vitals scores are improved and high enough now that the Post has dropped almost all of its AMP pages. So we do not need to maintain a whole separate code base for AMP anymore. That's engineering resources we can free up.
Oh, that's a great that's a great tip right there. Uh, it, it's good to avoid AMP when you can, right? And essentially you're building your own performance in it that allows you to avoid doing that, but also is increasing your core performance. That's really interesting. Again, because I do feel like, listen, we talk all the time in this industry about resource constraints, and particularly in the local side, there's a lot of financial constraints, and that's all completely real, right? And I wake up every day focused on how we can change that environment. That being said, there are things that may be right in front of you that you can start doing to improve the quality of the product. That again really does matter to readers immediately, and really does. You want them to enjoy the experience, particularly if you want them to affirmatively pay to keep coming back to experience it. Let's shift a little bit and talk about contextual, right? So it's a relatively easy intellectual jump that cookies are going away. Various forms of identifiers will be constrained, although to be determined. We'll talk more about that. That there may be a shift back to more contextual advertising based on what else is being read and consumed at the time. And then the interesting idea is then how do you build technologies around that rather than just having some person deciding, hey, it's a travel column, let's do a travel ad next to it. How to build the technologies around it. I am a little worried that news publishers will again be on the receiving end too much of other people's solutions around this. Again, we'll be providing the context without benefiting from the contextual ad. So I want us to have our points of view known, understood, and embraced here. But talk a little bit about, obviously you're thinking about it a lot in the context of Zeus and otherwise, how you guys are thinking about it and what sort of excites you and maybe what you're a little worried about in that shift.
Yeah. I mean, I think that the important thing to keep in mind, like we're getting a lot of incoming, pitches. Every publisher is for all of these like post-cookie technologies, etc. And we talked about like how there's a path. We're not going to be flipping a switch to one state and then going into the next state necessarily. But I do think sort of it's important to keep in mind that the end of the third-party cookie and the end of individually addressable advertising is inevitable. Like it's not a maybe or a who knows or anything like that. And I think a lot of people out there have an interest in pitching it that way. I think that these things are coming no matter what. And so that means really rethinking sort of how we handle these approaches, not letting other people handle it, not letting other companies decide how do these things work, how does our business work, that type of thing. And so I think that the important thing for contextual especially is thinking about who you partner with and being very careful with it and thinking about how we can sort of influence the future of these these processes, this feature of ad tech. I think I might have said this already, but this is like a real inflection point, and publishers have an opportunity to change things. Even small publishers don't have to just come along for the ride. Their voices, the voices of small publishers, medium-sized publishers, large publishers, not to mention trade organizations like yourself that represent publishers, those voices are more weighty than ever before. And I think that articulating and talking about how their business works is going to be an important part of it. And then the other thing is thinking through sort of contextual as a opportunity to enrich the site beyond just ads. This is an opportunity for personalization, an opportunity to increase sort of the depth of each visit, more page views per visit, that type of thing. We sort of have spent a lot of time thinking through and working on stuff like schema.org markup for structured metadata on each page. And that can help not just Google, but other mechanisms and other ad-driven mechanisms as well.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if that answers your question, but
Yeah, it does. I have to tell you, I hope whatever the next chapters are, one of the things that allows us to do better as an industry, by the way, is I've always made the argument that a news audience is a qualitatively different and qualitatively better audience for many advertisers because are people consuming in a relatively serious way, relatively serious content, right? As a news audience is there to do something serious, which is read about their community, read about the world, and that is an audience that's paying attention, by the way, and that too often in the iterations of ad tech systems we've been subjected to, somebody reading about what's going on in Russia is valued similarly to somebody flipping through 50 celebrity beach bodies, right? And that's because that equivalence, that suppression of difference, works best for the ad tech ecosystem. They don't want to figure out what's what, so we're gonna just plow everything down to dust and roll over top of it. I'm hoping that as we move into these contextual things, there may be some opportunity to kind of recapture that perspective, which I believe in, that a news audience is a different kind of audience. I don't know. Would you agree with that or not? Or
yeah, I do agree. I think like this gets to sort of the trouble of user targeted advertising, which is it undercuts and drains the ecosystem away from publishers and towards, outright fraud, malicious sites, misinformation. We've seen these effects all across the ecosystem in a lot of different ways in a lot of different places. My favorite stat about like digital advertising is there was a study of studies a few years ago that looked at all of the different studies that showed how much fraud was in the ad tech ecosystem. And they were like, the conclusion of the authors was basically, it's anywhere between 2% and 98%.
somewhere with a high degree of confidence within that distribution, huh?
Yeah, and so I think that's very telling of how really bad the ecosystem is right now. And I think that's sort of an opportunity that publishers have to realign themselves in some ways. The necessity of how the ad tech ecosystem has worked means that we've sort of been, like you've said, at the mercy of some of the ad tech decision making in that ecosystem. And as a result, I think, and I think readers have perceived this, it's misaligned publishers away from readers. When you hear someone complaining about like whether or not they don't trust a site or whether they think it's misinformation, the most common term to come up in those conversations is always clickbait or fake news, right?
Yeah.
And those terms are driven out of the fact that our readers understand in some way how this ecosystem works, even if they cannot articulate it, and they find it untrustworthy. And I think that's important. Informed readers are the publisher's bread and butter, and so we have to align with them because it's a core principle for them, and it benefits us for it to be a core principle for us if it wasn't, and it is. The users don't want their data sold off to this black box of unaccountable corporations. The last chart of ad tech participants had like over 8,000 products in it. It might even be more than that now. And we've been fighting our readers in a war over ad tech for over a decade. It's been a lot of work. It's been a lot of time and effort and thought put into that. And it's never benefited publishers. It's only benefited these entities that claim to speak for publishers, these sort of ad tech middlemen who tend to wear the publisher identity like a sock puppet in these
Oh,
conversations
absolutely.
about how this happens. Yeah. And so as a result, we've ended up fighting our readers over individualized user tracking. And that's a war that it's impossible for us to win. But when we look at context as a product, that aligns us with our readers in a really strong way. And exactly what you were talking about, right? Informed readers are the type of readers that advertisers want, and they're the type of readers that are only going to come through publishers, legitimate publishers. And so moving towards privacy in that regard is going to be something that, different publishers are going to have an easier or harder time with it. I think that's unavoidable. And I think, a lot of people won't necessarily talk much about this, but I do think that like 8,000 products that are in the ad tech ecosystem, with all of that lack of transparency and potential fraud, cannot survive privacy. That's why there's so much resistance in the ad tech space. There's going to be a lot of these products that they have built their promises off of user targeting, and when that becomes impossible, it goes away, right? And so I think that we have to look as instead saying, hey, we need to focus not on these sort of ad tech principles or concepts, but instead on being publishers, on serving our readership, and on doing what we have always done best, which is being trustworthy and informational. And then our contextual properties should support that. And that means that, not all context is a topic tag. Things like authors, things like information about publishing principles, which is a piece of metadata you can include in structured metadata conversations. One of the important things for helping search engines and therefore readers who are looking for content understand sort of how paywalls and rent rolls works is there is a metadata property in schema.org JSON objects that says, hey, this access is gated. And that's a way to understand performance, and that's a way to understand what you're entering there. And I think making it clearer and more transparent is really sort of the most important principle. And we've been pulled away from that. For many publishers, it hasn't necessarily been a choice, right? But this is the time, right?
Absolutely.
This is the time for us to speak up and talk about it and change things. I've been very happy to see some publishers and some publishing organizations showing up in lawmaking sessions and that type of stuff. And I think that sort of thing is going to be a very high value. And for the first time in a long time, we actually have the potential to create a real shift that benefits our users, our business, and our society. And that's a win-win-win. You can't get any better than that.
Oh yeah, amen, brother. You're talking about preaching to the choir. Let's talk. By the way, I love the whole your statistics around ad tech fraud. For years we as an industry had been beaten over the head by this famous John Wanamaker quote about I'm wasting 50% of my ad buy, I just don't know which 50%. And really in the ad tech space, you'd wish it was 50%. It's really an industry built on being able to sell perceived effectiveness as opposed to actual effectiveness. There's something amazing case study in that. But anyway, we're moving to different chapters. So let's talk about that. The processes for figuring out the new standards, the new approaches, the new products, the rest, right? It's confusing even to folks in it, and really confusing folks out of it. You have Google essentially really acting as a regulator mothership to some degree. They had the announcement today about their topic product. It wasn't like there were a lot of discussion drafts, at least not that we saw of, it wasn't a group think, it was their announcement. So you have Google as a regulator, but then you have W3C activities, you have IAB meandering around, then you have regulatory pressures on top of that. which, just out of curiosity, I don't know, which of those do you participate in, and where do you see things actually making progress and good ideas surfacing? And if you're willing to say it, you don't have to. Where do you see things not working very well?
Yeah, I participate in sort of every venue that will allow us to talk about our values and our interests in this stuff. I think
Hmm.
that the W3C is sort of a prime place to participate. It's easy to see sort of Google, W3C, IAB, regulators, etc., as this sort of amorphous mass of influences on us. But I think the flip side of that is that there are really a series of pressures, and a lot of those pressures are on Google right now. And you don't have to be a Google booster or a Google detractor to look at the situation as it is now and see they're getting oversight from attorney generals, they're getting oversight from regulators, laws are impacting their business. Their ability to move without asking the input of others is as constrained as it has ever been. And so they participate in the standards making process for stuff like the topics API or the other standards they've been working on through the W3C. And while they can make a lot of press and announcements out of announcing something that they are now trying out, it still has to go through a path towards standardization. And through convention and through Google's choices and other browsers' choices, and in fact, at this point, even through to some degree, and our favorite phrase when we talk about this stuff in the W3C is we're engineers, not lawyers, so not legal advice.
Hmm.
But some regulators have even seen the W3C as this venue for coming to a standard, coming to a sort of reconciliation over many proposals, many of which are coming from Google. And so I think like the W3C has become sort of the best place for publishers to attempt to weigh the scale of this conversation and these technologies in their direction. Like last year, I sort of went and talked about this more extensively, but the W3C is immensely important for publishers to bring their use cases to bring their interests and concerns to. We talked about this earlier, right? Publishers have been misrepresented by ad tech and big technology that claims to speak on their behalf. And that's happened basically forever, like since publishers started entering the web. And so the W3C is an opportunity for us to speak for ourselves. Even an hour out of every week in one community group can have an outsized impact in a way that participation in almost no other venue, I think, would, because it's an opportunity to make our opinions public, our use cases public, and to make it clear what's going on within publisher businesses that these different proposals impact. And that is really appreciated by all participants. And I will include, to their credit, Google here. I think that it's been so long that publishers have not had a direct voice in these conversations that one of the things that sort of amazed, surprised, and pleased me, I guess, about when we started talking in the W3C is how little our perspective has been represented, how unfamiliar it is to so many of the participants, and how when we made the choice to speak up, people listened, and that they listened and they took that feedback and they took our use cases and they turned them into real impact and changes within these proposals. The Washington Post is a W3C member, which means we have access to the whole suite of W3C meetings. We have engineers, we send them to a bunch of different meetings. But I think it's super valuable, and I think publishers can look at it as an opportunity, one, to be able to put their voice in and have it have a weight that it might not have in other places, because their voice has really been unheard in the process of building out the web, basically from like 2000 to now.
Yeah.
Like we've had 20 years where publishers really haven't spoken up in a technically influential way. And by that, I mean influencing the technology. And this is an opportunity for them to do so in a place where it has a difference. I think the other thing that makes it worthwhile is it's an opportunity to understand, find, and figure out how to implement best practices across a lot of different interests. Like, to take a step out of privacy, for example, we have a engineer who attends the accessibility group within the W3C. And they came out of that with best practices and useful things we can do to make our website more accessible, because in the process of building out and discussing standards, you get really deep into these things in a way that's super useful for building better websites. The same with, we have an engineer who participates with one of the CSS working groups, right? And that also a really great host of best practices and useful knowledge and things that we can start building out now to prepare for the future, now that we are sort of seeing it coming. The thing that a lot of people get wrong about sort of the standards making process is they assume that everything has to be gated through discussion first, but it really is. Someone like Chrome, part of the way the process is supposed to work is someone like Chrome team sets up a standard that they are proposing, and then they put it into their test environment and they say, here's an opportunity to test it. We're going to collect metrics on it. And then we're going to use those metrics to help talk about it as we move towards a finalized standard. And that means that there's an opportunity to build prototypes and to understand how these things have impact, and to even like just understand what's coming better. I understand, I spent a lot of my career working with smaller publishers and local publishers. Obviously, they don't have the resources to prototype every Google proposal, right? But reading it and understanding what it is, and understanding how it impacts and documenting how it can impact us is not a huge lift. It doesn't require code deployment or anything like that. But it can have a big impact. Oh,
No,
US,
no, I was just going to say, listen, again, man, I'm glad we're recording this, because there's so much good stuff in here, and good stuff that I agree with. Frankly, I spent a lot of my life, I am paid to be a voice for news publishers. I actually do represent news publishers as opposed to people who say they do, right? And one of the things I found is this industry had such little muscle memory advocating for itself in a whole range of different ways. And that is surprising to people, right? Because it used to be a huge industry, and obviously journalism and editorial pages and all that were highly influential. But weirdly, on terms of the business side of things, advertising environments, the issues I get involved with in terms of platform issues, there's really amazingly little kind of muscle memory in terms of standing up and saying, no, these are our unique views as news publishers, and that's important to be heard. And so one, it's sort of creating that, and what you've been doing is amazing. But also, I have to tell you, sometimes we get angry reactions from folks like, shut up, you're not, who are you, and sort of being able to, in those spaces, say, no, we do something important, sustains democracy, among other things, and we have our own particular views, which we're going to express and want to be heard. So I think you're absolutely right that grabbing this moment to where we can, we have the opportunity and openings to sort of assert our points of view is super important. So with that, this has been a great conversation. Let me circle back to a last question, which you sort of hinted on in your last answer a little bit, which is, if you are a smaller local publisher who's not the Washington Post, right? Doesn't necessarily have the resources, financial capacities, whatever. Just doesn't have the same capacities. But you're doing incredibly important things, right? You're sustaining your communities through great journalism. What piece of advice could you give somebody to? Here are some relatively easier ways to keep up, to get involved, to assert your points of view. What can you do as somebody who's running a lot of these issues as a small local publisher to help assert your points of view in this new chapters?
Yeah, I think, like I said, being verbal and talking about this stuff is really important, to documenting what your requirements are and the troubles you hit in these processes. That's really important. I think that it ties back to some of the other stuff we said. The sort of North Star for every publisher should be establishing and maintaining these trusted relationships with readers, and understanding that, like, when they do sign up for things, it is out of trust, and that trust can be very easily broken. I think one of the big sort of issues I've seen happen with smaller publishers is that they don't understand how valuable their user base is. You know, they don't understand how even something that is as basic as an emails list, right, can be the sort of thing that they might not want to share with everyone, because then they impact that trust in a way that readers are not going to be happy with. And I think that the question of sort of the low-hanging fruit, the easy wins that they can build on immediately within their own organizations, sort of all stem from that. I think we've talked a lot about Core Web Vitals, and I think that even if it didn't improve search placement, which it does, it improves user experience, and that always pays out dividends. And so that, and considering that, and considering some of the stuff we've already talked about, is going to be a big win for them. I think my favorite example of that I have from working with Zeus customers is, we had one publisher whose performance we really improved through Zeus. When they flipped on Zeus, really increased site performance, really increased Core Web Vitals. And they came back to us a little while later and told us that that increase in performance directly was relatable to an increase in subscription numbers. Right?
Yeah.
This is that holistic level of user trust, means treating our users with respect, giving our users the performance they need to interact with our site. And that pays out. It pays out in better advertising experiences. It pays out in better subscription experiences. It pays out in pretty much every way. When we talk about Core Web Vitals, we talk about it as sort of like the best example we have of like a win-win situation. Our attempt to improve our site's performance has led to better outcomes in every sort of category, when it comes to advertising, when it comes to SEO, when it comes to user relationships, at every level. And so where you can improve performance on your site, I think that always is going to pay off significantly. And I think the other thing is, start really sort of reassessing your partnerships, looking at the technologies you use, looking at the scripts that are on your pages, not just for performance reasons, but because of the stuff we talked about, that some of these ad tech providers may not be serving you as directly as you might thought. It's worthwhile to try turning things on and off, narrowing down your window of providers, testing these things to some extent. You know, turning a script tag on and off does not require a lot of work, does not require a lot of work for engineers. A lot of publishers use tools like Google Tag Manager, which means it's literally a checkbox that they could do and test for a little while. And I think that the contextual conversation comes back into it, and especially in terms of building out metadata on your site. I think one of the interesting sort of trends that we've seen, and this, you know, is one of those things where in some cases it's for the better, and in some cases it's for the worse, depending on who we're interacting with, is site content is being pulled into other contexts. It's being pulled into reading tools. It's being pulled into stuff like Google News. I think that as we move away from individualized user targeting, that sort of trend will only continue, because context is going to be more important, and making the context clearer for readers and for tooling is going to be really important as well. So putting stuff like making it visible on page in some cases, but also better metadata tagging, better use of stuff like schema.org, tags, and JSON LD. These are things where, like, there's a lot of pre-existing tools that publishers can leverage, that can act server side, that don't have to decline their performance, and can have good payouts for them. And I think, like, the other thing is to really sort of focus in. I suspect that as you go through this podcast, you're going to have a lot of people who have suggestions for publishers and what they can do and what to get involved with. And I think that thinking those through in some detail and being very focused is important. One of the things that sort of worries me more than anything else is thinking about how the ad tech landscape is going to shift as browsers become more private. I think like we're always seeing this move towards connected TV or CTV, and we're always seeing this shift towards OOH, out of home type of advertising. And I think you have to engage in conversations with the advertisers you have relationships with, because a lot of that stuff is built on top of the exact same problems that browsers had, the promises of specific metrics and specific targeting that just are not as possible as what the marketing is promising it is. I feel like in some ways, I've been a big fan of watching the coverage and reading the books and podcasts and whatever around like the Theranos stuff.
Yeah.
And I think, a lot of people sort of look at that and think of it, oh, this is an anomaly. But when I look at it, I say, oh, she's just applying all the techniques that every ad tech company applies to their startups. Yeah. And the only difference is it's very easy to prove when your blood is not being tested correctly, but it's very difficult to prove when your ad is not being targeted correctly. Yeah. And so when we are moving towards contextual, the other piece of it is moving towards transparency. When we talk about Zeus, one of the sort of core principles we bring up to publishers is, even though our code is closed source, the operation on the page is highly transparent. We even give our publishers a developer tool that they can load into Chrome to see what's happening on the page. And that like comes out of this principle of transparency. Like I said, I'd love to sell everybody Zeus, but it's not just Zeus that can do this, and it's not just on the ad tech side that can do this. Being transparent with advertisers and readers and the other systems that interact with your page is only going to become more important towards making that pitch, on one hand to readers to say, you can trust us, sign up, subscribe, and making the pitch on the other hand to advertisers saying, you can trust us, the metrics we are giving you are accurate. Yeah. This has always been the struggle. One of my favorite things, I think, that I tell people who are entering the news engineering or news product space is that they should always do at least 4 things when they enter the space, which is they should spend a day or 3 riding along with a salesperson. Yeah. They should do at least one piece of user research where you take a notebook, you sit behind a user who's trying to interact with your site, and you understand how they are interacting on their native machine with what you've built. You look at what your marketing team is doing and understand what their goals and expectations are and how they try and meet them. And you sit in on at least one editorial meeting. And I think as we're thinking about building these things out, thinking about those challenges that those people face and recentering on those problems is where we can sort of think about how to rebuild our impacts and our sites. The salespeople, like one of the things that is always the problem is getting advertisers to trust our metrics, right? And there's a great, there was a great article about agencies and clawbacks that came out a couple of years ago that triggered an FBI investigation into this, right? And like it's actually not clear if it did trigger the FBI investigation. I guess it's an alleged to have triggered an FBI investigation. But the thing is that like the problem there is transparency, and publishers have never really found a way to pick up where ad tech has fallen there. The ad tech landscape is this huge black box. And like you said, so much of the money falls away in that in-between part before it gets to the publisher. But so much of what it's falling away for is things that are supposed to make it accountable. Yeah. And so publishers saying, hey, accountability is one of our prime principles, right? We're accountable to readers. Let's take that same accountability and make ourselves clearer and more transparent to advertisers and try and talk to them about this process, because we have to be a counterweight to the forces within the ad tech landscape that are trying to shift advertiser spend towards the
Yeah.
CTV or OOH stuff, the big thing that has to change there is advertisers spend right now is always shifting towards the least accountable process.
Yeah.
um and
Yeah,
so
and to your point, where we always get criticized or about metrics and accountability, when the alternative is almost in every respect much less accountable, right? But that seems to be okay, right? That's amazing. Listen, thank you so much. This has been a incredibly compelling hour. I think it's a lot of high value for news publishers out there in our audience. I really appreciate you doing this, and I look forward to doing it again. Something tells me there'll be a lot more stuff to talk about as we're going forward. Aram
yeah,
Zucker-Scharff, thank you so much. Very much appreciate you being with us today.
yeah, glad to be here. And I think, if there's one thing that your listeners can sort of take away from this, it's that they should not be afraid of privacy. This is the biggest opportunity we have to restructure the business we exist in towards a positive for us, for our readership, and for the society we exist in. And I think that's really important to take away from this. If you take away anything, I know I talked a lot. Maybe you come
Yeah.
from this conversation and go ask us about buying Zeus too, but that is the most important thing, really, is to improve how everything runs. And I think the path towards that is better privacy for our readership.
Don't be afraid of privacy. That's a fantastic ending. Thank you so much. Take care, and thank you everybody for listening.